Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here, and thank you for inviting me. I'm going to make the case for the agnostics in the room. And I want to begin with two caveats. First, I think that it's incredibly important that we acknowledge that the global knowledge society is an incredibly fuzzy concept. Second, I want to suggest, perhaps to rain on this parade, but not to cast any shadows, that perhaps we're asking the wrong question when we think about promises and perils. Questions we ask are very important. I'm reminded of the story of two priests who happened to be smokers who wrote to the Pope asking questions. The first priest wrote to the Pope to say, "Is it okay for me to smoke while praying?" To which the Pope had responded, "No. When praying, you're supposed to concentrate and immerse yourself completely in prayer." The second priest had written and asked, "Is it okay for me to pray while smoking?" To which the Pope responded, "Why, yes, of course, any time's a good time to pray." And I think that this story has implications for how we think about the global knowledge society, and I want to go over some of those issues, or some of the points for me. I should also point out, too, that as somebody who comes from the communications program, my focus tends to be very much on the relationships between information and communication technologies and global knowledge societies. Now, I'm somebody who's long been interested in different perspectives on technologies, both whether we see them as tools for emancipation and progress versus seeing them as tools for constraints on society. And that dialogue, that debate impacts a lot of the thinking around global knowledge society. It also plays to one of the key questions that we often immerse students in communication studies with, which is a fundamental tension between an eternal conflict, which on the one hand, where we see information and knowledge as raw resources for citizenship that should be governed by criteria of need, by criteria of right and communality, but also on the other hand, the contradictory notion that information and knowledge are commodities for consumers that should be governed first and foremost by market principles. And much of the thinking I want to suggest to you with regards to global knowledge societies, from my perspective, fits into this sort of tension. Now, for me, much of my thinking about the intersection between the promise and the peril is influenced by an article that was written by one of the founding fathers of the Canadian School of Communication Studies, which is a gentleman by the name of Dallas Smythe. In 1984, Dallas published an article in which he was dealing with or examining the tensions or the way in which technology was broached within emerging information society discourses. And Dallas's message was fairly clear. The gist of his argument was that technology was a myth, and that we need to be very careful of attempts to distinguish or to divide technology and society into two neat categories. I want to suggest to you that some 30 years later, a lot of contemporary theorizing and thinking about information society and knowledge societies continues to put forward this notion of technology as something that exists external to society. The idea that technology shows up and does something to society. We'll implement open government data systems, society will become more democratic. We'll implement MOOC platforms, education will become much more pervasive. We see some of this notion of sort of separating technology from society even in some of the outlines for the discussion tonight. The issue, why is this problematic? Well, the two key issues. One, more often than not, we wind up putting the onus or see the agent of change as being the platform or the technology in question. Second, in so doing, we tend to overlook the organizational complexities that are associated with the production and distribution of information and knowledge. And not only that, we often take for granted that those technologies will act on society in logical and rational ways. And I think we've already heard very clearly this evening that that's not the case. Now, what Smythe was pointing to, and what struck me since the first time I came across it, was basically, Smythe was basically making a call for us to critically interrogate our theories of change, okay? Or in evaluations, our performance logic. Specifically, the performance logic that's associated with ideas of knowledge societies and information society. Now, he had an interesting way of putting this forward in his argument with regards to thinking about the myth of technology, as he put it. And Smythe's argument was to say, look, on the one hand, yes, technology is material. But when we think about technology and its relationship to society, there are 6 key elements which we need to keep in mind at all times. One part's bureaucracy, both private and public sector bureaucracy. The second part is science, which he was arguing in 1984 was becoming increasingly taken over by capital. the third criteria. The fourth part was the tools and machines that are created by the engineers, as he put it. The fifth part was ideology, which provides the raw materials for which the sixth part, propaganda, is used to shape and mold public opinion. Now, what's noteworthy about this view, and why am I bringing forth these six key elements? Well, what I want to suggest to you is that Smythe's definition points to the need for us to take into account the range of communication opportunities that are available to people, and, very importantly, the ability of people to actually make use of these options, to achieve the things they value and the things that they have reason to value. At its core, what Smythe was calling for was a recognition that communication policy is social policy, and that when forming this social policy, it does need to be evidence-based. Seen in this light, I want to suggest this evening that polarized visions about global knowledge society, they may make for fun and interesting reading and for great dialogue, but I want to suggest that they're perhaps not a particularly useful or helpful prism for understanding the historical juncture in which we find ourselves today. And I want to suggest 4 reasons why I believe this is so. First, the knowledge society concept is anchored in a sender-receiver model of communication that dates back to Shannon and Weaver's classic mathematical model of communication. Now, although this model makes intuitive sense, it's long been critiqued and it's no longer taken particularly seriously because of its failure to take on board social variables, contextual factors that affect the communication process, whether those be language, whether those be culture, whether those be individual traits. Such variables are central to issues of building and applying knowledge for human development. The second point, oftentimes the global knowledge society narratives, by giving pride of place to technology, tend to be anchored in the notion that better communication necessarily flows from better technology. And while it's certainly true that technological innovation may certainly improve the quality of information and make its transfer cheaper, quicker, and spread over vast geographical differences, I want to suggest to you that it's a mistake to think that better wiring alone will eliminate the problems of transferring information into knowledge. This has implications, for example, with regards to thinking about the need to distinguish between information and knowledge. They are not synonymous. At another level, one could take it to the point of thinking about differences between tacit and codified knowledge, right? I have my grandmother's recipes for extraordinary chocolate chip cookies. To this day, I've yet to match Grandma's magic, okay? The third point that I think we want to overlook, I think, Paul, you mentioned it, is that oftentimes we tend to overlook the structural inequalities and power relations that are in play within global knowledge societies. Information and communication technologies are wonderful things, but they are not the great equalizer in and of themselves. All too frequently, claims about their progressive and emancipatory promise tend to reflect historical amnesia about the democratic, the economic, the political, the social virtues of previous generations of communication technologies spanning from railways to electrification to the telegraph to telephones, radio, television, internet, most recently mobile phones. Fourth, and perhaps I think I won't say most importantly, but certainly very importantly, the global knowledge society is anchored in a universalizing notion of progress and development that risks not recognizing the diversity of knowledges at play. UNESCO itself in the early 2000s pointed out that we need to talk about knowledge societies plural, not least because the plural sanctions the need for an accepted diversity. Okay? In UNESCO's own words, the plurality inherent in the concept of knowledge societies implies diversity, variety, and openness to choice. Accordingly, UNESCO wants to ensure that information societies evolve into knowledge societies, in which people can access and exchange the quality of information and ideas that are relevant to their life and their development. So in wrapping up, the principal idea I want to leave you with is twofold. First, that when we think about the global knowledge society, we need to recognize that there are contested values and contested interests at play. Therefore, if our interest is in ensuring the well-being of the supposed beneficiaries of the global knowledge society, beyond just commercial actors, we need to focus on the uses and the users of information, as well as the economic, social, technological, institutional issues affecting people's participation in the global knowledge society, the issues of opportunity to engage in the knowledge society. Second, rather than focusing on the promises and perils in a manner that gives pride of place to technological platforms, I want to suggest to you, in line with some of Robin Manzel's work, that it may be more productive to recognize that norms, values, conventions, and aspirations for societies within which we live are changing, but they are not changing autonomously in response to technologies of the information society. They are changing in response to human actions and decisions that are ongoing, contested, and uneven in their outcomes. Now, this in turn leaves me with my final point. I began with the importance of questions. I want to suggest an alternative question for us to think about. For me, perhaps the most important question that we need to think about is asking, what are the conditions, whether they be economic, social, political, legal, under which information and communication technologies might most effectively enable people to actualize the promises of the global knowledge societies? In so doing, by asking that type of question, our analysis shifts away from promises and perils of technology towards focusing in on the constraints and opportunities, the capabilities that influence how people can access, harness, and benefit from information and communication technologies in a manner that enhances their well-being. Thank you.